I mean,
Yo, dog, I heard you like articles.
yeah.
God damn, dude.
I'm just gonna skip ahead a little bit, and Bernie was defending at least the as Levitz describes it, the Bernie Sanders position of what he thinks is like a normal humane response, which is that we should do everything possible to help Ukraine, to help them without triggering a Russian military response. But I mean, like it's a question of where you draw the line, or
Yeah.
it's and it's difficult. And again, I'm not baking here. I'm not a baker. I don't got buns in the oven here. But everyone's trying to figure it out as best they can. But okay, I'm just gonna skip ahead a little bit.
I mean, like, how do you look at this, and how do you look, at the last 8 years and not conclude like anything I propose is meaningless now?
Yeah.
The bad things already happened, which is not just your provocation. NATO's provocation was answered, as so many people actually fucking wanted, with tons of fucking innocent people caught in the crossfire fighting their war for them. We already did the near decade of unaccountable weapon shipments, and we will, really Ukrainians will live with the consequences of that for decades to come. It's already happened. All the bad things have already been done, and there is nothing you can do.
Well, the one thing you can do is, if you're a journalist looking to advance in your career as with the left brand, is show the people who might hire you that you're a serious person who is not going to be during crises like this is not going to be a liability. And so you got to write this article. Everybody's got to write this fucking article. It's literally like an audition tape.
I don't see how you can have a clear understanding of the world, know what time it is, sort of see yourself as a realistic person, brand yourself as this acceptable left liberal, and suggest anything but free passage and citizenship for anyone from any of these countries that what America does to them, which is most countries. That's the only thing that should be on the table, but instead you're showing maybe 9,000 people who read this article how normal you are.
Levitz continues, within the small world of self-identified American leftists, however, the DSA's substantive positions are far from marginal. Indeed, a large contingent of prominent left-wing writers, activists, and organizations have argued in recent days for ending indiscriminate U.S. sanctions against Russia, withholding military aid from Ukraine, and immediately dismantling NATO. This contingent's perspective deserves to be taken seriously. For one thing, its analysis spotlights many inconvenient truths that few other American political factions wish to acknowledge. As importantly, however, the weakness of some of its arguments reflect genuine pathologies within the U.S. left's foreign policy thinking. Above all, an ideological rigidity that leaves American socialists ill-equipped to interpret this emerging multipolar world order and therefore to change it. Many on the American left were ideologically unprepared for Putin's invasion. As 190,000 Russian troops massed on the Ukrainian border in January and February, conventional wisdom among U.S. leftists held that no war was in the offing. They were hardly alone in that assessment. The Ukrainian government had itself argued that Western officials were overhyping the threat it faced. Some mainstream Kremlinologists believed the same. They noted that Russia's state media was not preparing its populace for a major war, and that a full-scale invasion of Ukraine made little strategic sense. Vladimir Putin might be ruthless, the reasoning went, but he was not reckless. Many leftists echoed these premises, but their widespread, if hardly universal, failure to anticipate Putin's intentions was not rooted in such dispassionate analysis alone. The vehemence with which some socialists automatically dismissed the U.S. government's narrative, which is to say its over-the-top prediction that Putin was intent on marching to Kiev and toppling the Ukrainian government, betrayed ideological discomfort with that possibility. Okay, so where do you want to go with this one? Because, Levitz is right. I didn't expect Putin to go full war in Ukraine. And, I'll cop to that. But, whatever. I don't have a fucking crystal ball here. I don't know what Levitz thought was going to happen. But
usually they're doing the same thing with Iraq, only, I guess, flipped in this one, where it's like, well, yeah, you were right. You were wrong for the right, or you were right, but for the wrong reasons. And now it was, you were wrong, and everyone was basically wrong, but you were extra wrong because you didn't have the rigorous analysis behind your wrongness. I'm sorry if everybody got the wrong conclusion. If everybody got the wrong answer, what the fuck difference does it make? Especially since you're on the outside. What else do you have to go for by ideology? Nobody who is not in government and doesn't have access to actual intelligence, whatever the fuck that is going off of anything other than their preconceived priors and the mood, the vibe, because nobody fucking knows.
And as long as you're talking about priors here, for Eric here, if I can cop to my own reasoning, the vehemence with which I dismissed the U.S. government narrative was simply based on the last 3+ decades of being alive and observant,
Yeah.
of just paying attention as best one can to how current events play out and what the U.S. government says about them.
Yeah.
I have a personal policy that I've followed for a long time of I do not make predictions. This bookie does not take bets in Eastern Europe. And that, kept me from too many bad screenshots of me predicting otherwise. But is there going to be a tongue wagging at Zelensky, who is basically saying the exact same fucking thing?
Yeah, but he wasn't doing it because of ideological rigidity.
Right.
In the realm of foreign affairs, America's left-wing activists and intellectuals are at our most cogent and self-confident when holding the U.S. government to account for offenses against the peace. And before Putin's invasion, it wasn't that hard to see the Russia-Ukraine crisis as a byproduct of America's overweening imperial ambition if you cock your head to the left. As socialists have emphasized in recent weeks, the U.S. backed NATO's expansion in the 1990s and 2000s in defiance of both its promises to Russian authorities and the counsel of its own national security elite. Nevertheless, the U.S. carried on projecting power eastward, eventually extending an offer of NATO membership to Ukraine itself. This drew objections from the socialist left, but also from the likes of Henry Kissinger, who warned that trying to turn Ukraine into an outpost of the West would risk its very survival, since to Russia, Ukraine can never be just a foreign country.
Sounds like they were right. Sounds like they were fucking right. Like, what is the counterpoint to this? What other fucking policy was put in place in America?
America proceeded to seek influence over Ukraine's domestic politics, using soft power to channel Ukrainians' domestic discontents over corruption and economic stagnation towards a movement for Western integration. Following 2014's Maidan uprising, the U.S. lent its backing to a Ukrainian government that undermined the language rights of Russian speakers and other minority ethnicities. The U.S. did all of this knowing that, one, there were profound divisions within Ukrainian society over the questions of language policy and whether to align with Russia or Europe. Two, that Russia had repeatedly signaled that it considered a Western-aligned Ukraine intolerable. And three, that NATO wasn't actually prepared to fight in defense of Ukraine's sovereignty should it come under Russian attack. I mean, I don't know, what argument is Eric advancing here?
Right. I mean, the question of whether Ukraine aligns with Europe or Russia, the language that is all obviously completely their fucking business. I mean, now it seems like things are quite settled thanks to the most genius invasion of all time. But the moment you introduce American institutions, the moment that you put every fucking tentacle of the American empire in place, the moment that you pump money in from world institutions and it goes into companies who kind of just create positions just for the sons and daughters of American politicians to siphon out, you taint those questions. You taint the natural political processes of the nation.
He goes, in sum, in the left's account, U.S. foreign policy placed the advancement of Western influence above the welfare of ordinary Ukrainians, whose security and domestic stability would have been maximized by an embrace of neutrality between the great powers to its east and west. This remains a worthwhile critique of America's policies towards Ukraine. Indeed, Putin's war of aggression only underscores America's recklessness in declaring that Ukraine would one day join a military alliance hostile to Russia, only to refuse for more than a decade to actually grant Ukraine that alliance's protections. So, I mean, is Eric saying that we should have let Ukraine join NATO, or we shouldn't have offered it to them in the first place?
I think he's saying that all this stuff was right, but then once the war starts, it becomes irrelevant, and you're doing war crimes by bringing it up.
Right. Once the bad thing that you said will happen as a result of this happens, it shows how wrong you are.
And you have to shut up and wave the blue and yellow flag. I don't know how this is different than any other emergent crisis caused by American imperial overreach that we then are told. Like, I don't know how this is not just more of the same. How this is differentiable in any way from fucking the Atlantic Monthly line on it. I just because he's willing to, granted, everything they said was right before, he just says, but you still have to shut up and do and follow this fucking line.
He goes here. Yet even before Russia's invasion, the left's dominant narrative about the crisis in Ukraine had its awkward aspects. It is perfectly natural for foreign policy realists like Kissinger to disdain heedless affronts to Russia's sphere of influence, or to insist that Ukraine must give Putin's kleptocratic regime veto power over its foreign policy. But socialists do not generally recognize the legitimacy of imperial orbits, nor counsel acquiescence to the relations of domination for the sake of conflict
Do they
avoidance.
acknowledge reality?
Yeah.
Do they acknowledge that Russia is a country with nukes and a perceived like national interest that it's going to pursue? You're going to pretend that's not real?
What is the good guy position to fight to the last Ukrainian?
Yeah, I mean, or just that, like, not the good guy position is not to say Ukrainians must fight to the last man against Russia. But you can think that, you don't say it, but then you scold the people who are saying otherwise.
Yeah.
Or saying that,
Just
like,
saying maybe don't dump more weapons into this fucking thing.
Meanwhile, the notion that Russia's opposition to NATO expansion was rooted in legitimate security interests, as a segment of leftists routinely avow, is hard to credit. Surely a nation's only legitimate security interests are defensive ones, and Russia's nuclear arsenal was always sufficient to deter the threat of an invasion. As we are now seeing, that arsenal is menacing enough to stop Western leaders from entertaining so much as a no-fly zone for Ukraine, never mind an offensive invasion of Russian territory.
What difference does it make if I think it's legitimate or not?
Yeah.
Who gives a shit? The legitimacy is determined by the power that the state has to affirm its legitimacy. That's what makes it legitimate, is that if you don't agree, they will do something about it. There is no legitimacy that exists outside of power projection and force projection. You're supposed to live in a fantasy land and to assert this hypothetical notion of legitimacy on a foreign country. And again, that is the signal difference, is because you're talking about values versus like an analysis of just reality, and they're always pointing out like, well, you have these values when you're talking about America, but all of a sudden when you talk about these other countries, you're embracing realism, and you're not using languages of morals and all that. Well, the reason people talk about their own country morally is because they're trying to effect a political change.
Yeah.
They're trying to make a pitch for a politics that other people can sign on to and do something about. That project is totally pointless when referring to other countries, and doing so, insisting on larding on moralistic language, only makes it harder to actually understand and discuss what the fuck is going on.
To avoid giving Russia the dreaded legitimacy rune that they can take to the tower and boost their stats by 20%, the left is giving them. I think this invasion is completely criminal and awful, and it's undeniable that innocent people are dying as a direct result of Russia's actions. That if your concern is Azov, which I think is a very real concern, not just Azov, but other similar groups, that this is the best thing you could have done for their recruiting. That said, if Mexico had joined a union of states backed by nuclear power with a bunch of other Latin American states, a defense pact that we were specifically excluded from as Americans, they would write this article about people on the left who are against invading Mexico. For reality's sake.
They're writing articles in Bloomberg right now that AMLO's decision to just buy back one of Shell's refineries and have the Mexican state refine their own oil and gas is economic imperialism.
Yeah.
So what the fuck do you think we would do if they joined a defensive alliance with like China or Russia?
Yeah.
Orthodoxy. Some leftists turned against reality. Once Putin validated the Western media's predictions, the American left's ideological orthodoxies ceased to provide it with unambiguous policy guidance. Socialists generally support the self-determination struggles of nations victimized by imperial aggression. They are also typically wary of flooding war zones with American munitions. DSA supporters of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against Israel affirm the legitimacy of economic sanctions as a means of liberating people from military domination. Yet, such leftists also know that sanctions are a form of collective economic punishment against civilians and routinely decry their use. The American left disdains NATO for its destructive humanitarian inventions, yet it also prizes solidarity with socialists in less fortunate corners of the globe. And many Eastern European leftists consider NATO a vital bulwark against their republic's subjugation to a reactionary autocracy, a conviction that became difficult to dismiss once